It was a regular afternoon. Or at least, it seemed that way. But for one senior female Army officer, this was a day that would shatter her sense of safety, her belief in justice, and her view of law enforcement. What should have been a routine traffic stop turned into a confrontation that no one saw coming. As the tension between the officer and a local cop escalated, something broke, something deep. The kind of broken trust that takes years to build and seconds to destroy. Imagine yourself in her shoes. You're a highly respected senior officer in the military, a woman who has spent decades serving your country with honor, discipline, and courage. You've fought for the rights and freedoms of others. Yet, as you drive down the street, you're suddenly confronted by a police officer who doesn't seem to care about your rank or your history. He's aggressive, rude, and then, without warning, he pulls out his weapon, aiming it straight at you. What happens next is almost unbelievable. But it's real. The situation spirals out of control fast, and within moments, a police officer finds himself facing the consequences of his reckless actions. But this is only the beginning of the story. This isn't just about one officer losing his cool, it's about a system that's broken and the hard truths we have to face about abuse of power, racial tension, and the dangers of unchecked authority. This incident sparks a much larger conversation that reaches beyond one officer and one Army officer. It forces us to examine the ways in which we interact with each other, the assumptions we make based on appearances, and the larger societal issues that continue to plague us. But there's more to this story. What happened after the officer pulled that gun? How did this encounter turn into a turning point for justice? And why does the fallout of this moment have implications far beyond the two people involved? As the camera rolls, you can see the Army officer's calm, steely resolve, an unwavering figure of strength in the face of danger. But it's clear that even she is shocked by the officer's actions. In those few, intense seconds, everything she's known about the role of law enforcement seems to collapse. And with that, a crucial question remains: how far are we willing to go to hold someone accountable for crossing the line, especially when they're supposed to be there to protect us? But before we dive into the aftermath, the true consequences of the officer's actions, and what happens to him next, we need to look closely at what led to this defining moment. Why did a simple traffic stop become something much bigger? Stay tuned as we unravel the chilling details of what unfolded that afternoon, the powerful reactions from both sides, and the shocking fallout that has left the community reeling. The seconds that followed felt like an eternity. The senior officer, standing her ground in a situation that was spiraling out of control, knew this wasn't just about a simple traffic violation. This was about something far deeper. She had been in high-stakes situations before, commanding respect on the battlefield, navigating difficult negotiations, and making life-or-death decisions. But this moment, right here, felt different. The officer who had pulled her over wasn't just a man with a badge. He was someone who seemed determined to escalate the situation, to make it about something personal rather than professional. In the split second it took him to unholster his weapon and point it at her, it was clear, he wasn't thinking clearly. His actions were reckless, his judgment clouded, and that very decision would soon have severe consequences, not just for him, but for the very integrity of the system he represented. The Army officer's mind raced, but she remained calm. Years of training and experience kept her grounded, her voice steady as she attempted to de-escalate the situation. Her military background gave her an advantage in a way most civilians wouldn't understand. But even so, the anger and fear of the moment were unmistakable, as she realized the officer wasn't going to back down. The power imbalance was glaringly obvious now. Here she was, an accomplished leader, and yet she was at the mercy of someone who clearly had no regard for her status, her service, or her humanity. What happened next was almost instantaneous. The gun in the officer's hand didn't go off, but the shockwave of what had occurred rippled through the entire community. Someone in authority had just lost their sense of control. the chain of command, the integrity of law enforcement, and the respect for public service all seemed to break down in that one moment. A critical line had been crossed, and no one, least of all the officer, could ignore the weight of what had just happened. As the senior officer's composure finally forced the officer to back down, the reality set in. This wasn't just about one person's reckless actions, it was about the larger implications of systemic issues within law enforcement. The officer, who had acted out of bias and rash judgment, now faced the consequences of his own actions. But the question remained, what kind of accountability would come next? Would this be another case of a badge protecting its own, or would there be a true reckoning? As the story unfolds, we begin to understand that the impact of this moment stretches far beyond the initial confrontation. The officer's behavior didn't just spark outrage, it set off a chain of events that would forever change the lives of those involved and prompt the community to take a hard look at how these kinds of incidents should be handled. The Army officer, now with a deeper understanding of how easily power could be misused, was left to wonder, could things have been different if the officer had acted with even a fraction of the training and discipline she had honed over years of service? Could a moment like this be prevented, or is the danger of such encounters something we all need to confront, head-on? In the next part of the story, we'll see the fallout as the police officer faces the consequences of his actions, and we'll hear from the community as they weigh in on what needs to change in our law enforcement system. The road to justice is never straightforward, but one thing is clear, the moment that gun was pointed in the direction of a senior officer changed everything. In the hours that followed the confrontation, the scene replayed in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it, whether from the bystanders on the street or the officers who responded in the aftermath. To an outsider, the situation might have seemed like an isolated incident, a traffic stop gone wrong. But for those involved, it was far from that simple. It was a wake-up call, a reminder that in an instant, everything can change. The senior officer, shaken but resolute, found herself caught between two worlds. On one hand, she was an experienced military leader, someone who had seen the worst of humanity, had faced danger head-on countless times, and had fought for the safety and well-being of others. On the other hand, she was a civilian in a moment where the rules of the game seemed unclear. She had always trusted that law enforcement, the very institution she had fought to protect, would be a beacon of safety and justice. But the encounter she had just experienced shattered that trust. The officer's actions, aggressive, unprovoked, and downright dangerous, had made her question everything she knew about the system meant to uphold the law. In the back of her mind, a question gnawed at her: how could an officer, someone entrusted with the power to protect and serve, go so far off course? It wasn't just the gun that had been pointed at her, it was the underlying assumption that she, as a woman, as a person of color, didn't deserve respect, that she wasn't someone to be treated with dignity. The officer had acted based on an instinct, an immediate judgment, that she didn't belong in the situation she was in. And that was the most unsettling part of all. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Davis sat in a small, dimly lit room, his hands trembling. His heart still raced, his breath shallow. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He had been on patrol for years, he had seen it all: car chases, robberies, even violent confrontations. But this wasn't like anything he had ever faced before. A senior Army officer, no less, a woman in uniform, no less, and he had pointed his gun at her. In the heat of the moment, Davis had let his emotions cloud his judgment. It wasn't the first time he'd been frustrated by an interaction with someone who seemed to be questioning his authority. But something about the way she stood there, calm and composed, had triggered something deeper within him. His instincts had told him she wasn't cooperating, that she was hiding something. But in truth, it wasn't her that he was angry with. It was something far more ingrained: his own biases, his own inability to separate his assumptions from the reality of the situation. But as soon as his finger had wrapped around the trigger, he knew he had crossed a line. Davis's thoughts were interrupted as his supervisor entered the room, his face grim. "You need to explain yourself, Davis," the supervisor said, his voice low. There was no anger in his tone, just a quiet seriousness that sent a chill down Davis's spine. He had seen his supervisor in action before, and he knew what that look meant. This was serious. His future was now in question, and he knew that the ramifications of his actions weren't just about him anymore. They were about something bigger. The consequences of what he had done extended far beyond his personal career. It had the potential to affect the entire department. Davis's hands fumbled as he tried to gather his thoughts. "I didn't mean for it to escalate like that," he muttered, his voice shaky. I don't know what happened." She wasn't listening. She wasn't following orders. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the fragmented memory of what had occurred, but it all felt blurry now, like an out-of-body experience. His supervisor looked at him with pity. "You pointed your gun at a senior officer," he said slowly. "Do you understand what that means?" Davis nodded, though the weight of the question felt suffocating. He knew what it meant. The officer in front of him had already made up his mind. This wasn't just about his behavior, it was about something much more significant. His supervisor's words were clear. This was an issue of professionalism, of trust, and perhaps even more painfully, of race. Davis's actions wouldn't just be seen as an isolated mistake, they would be framed through a much broader lens, a lens that scrutinized how he treated people, especially those who didn't look like him. Back at the scene of the confrontation, the Army officer, now identified as Lieutenant Colonel Monroe, had returned to her car. The initial rush of adrenaline had subsided, but a deep, unsettling anger lingered. She didn't know whether she was angry at the officer for his reckless behavior or at herself for allowing the situation to escalate as far as it had. In the years she had served her country, she had been through far worse. She had been under fire in hostile territories, had made life-and-death decisions in the blink of an eye, and yet, this situation, this civilian encounter with a police officer, felt more dangerous, more real. She sat in her car for a long moment, her mind whirring with 1,000 thoughts. The officer had pulled his weapon on her. She had been calm, collected, and in control of the situation, but in that split second, she had realized just how fragile that control really was. The dynamics between law enforcement and the military were complex, and she knew that this incident, if it were to go public, would spark debates about authority, race, and power. It wasn't just about her. It was about how institutions like law enforcement and the military interacted, how their power could be misused, and how people were judged based on biases that had no place in either field. Lieutenant Colonel Monroe knew she couldn't let this go. This wasn't about personal retribution, it was about holding someone accountable for a lapse in judgment that could have had far more serious consequences. The officer had endangered her life. But even more disturbingly, he had endangered the trust between the community and the very institutions meant to protect it. And so, she made a decision. This wasn't going to be something she could brush off. She would file a report. She would make sure that someone heard her side of the story. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't help but wonder, was this just one officer acting out, or was this indicative of a much larger issue within the force? Would her complaint be buried, or would it spark real change? For now, though, the answers remained elusive. The officer's actions would be investigated, but the uncertainty of what would come next hung heavy in the air. The system was meant to protect those who served their communities. But had it failed this time? And if so, what would it take to rebuild the trust that had been shattered in that moment? The tension between Lieutenant Colonel Monroe's sense of duty and the deep frustration she felt at the officer's actions would linger for days, perhaps even weeks. And the question of what would happen to Officer Davis, a question that had yet to be answered, hung in the balance. Would he face the consequences of his rash behavior, or would the system fail once again to hold one of its own accountable? The truth remained unclear, and the stakes were higher than anyone realized. The days after the incident felt like a slow-burning fuse that had no clear end. For Lieutenant Colonel Monroe, each passing moment brought more questions than answers. She had done everything by the book, stayed calm, never escalated the situation herself, but now she found herself tangled in a web of uncertainty. She had expected that the law enforcement community would back one of their own, especially given that she wasn't just a civilian but someone who wore the uniform of the country. But as she started to speak with others about what had happened, she couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't going to go the way she hoped. The police department had promised an internal review, but Monroe knew all too well how these investigations could be swept under the rug. She had seen it happen in the military, where higher-ups would find ways to protect one of their own when the pressure was on. But this wasn't just about some minor misstep. She had seen the fear in the officer's eyes when he pointed that gun at her. He hadn't been thinking about the law. He had been thinking about power, who had it, who didn't, and that was a dangerous thing to overlook. Monroe knew it wasn't just a personal vendetta. It was something much bigger. The more she thought about it, the more she realized how often people like her were pushed aside in these interactions. She didn't want to make this about race, but it was hard to ignore how the officer had treated her differently from how he would have treated someone else, a man, perhaps, or someone who didn't appear to be in uniform. She had heard the whispers over the years, the way people, especially women of color, were often held to different standards in all walks of life. This felt like one of those moments. But she wasn't sure if she could prove it. As the days passed, the public attention surrounding the incident grew. News outlets picked up the story, and the community, both local and online, began to weigh in. Some rallied behind Monroe, calling for justice and demanding accountability. Others, however, were quick to defend Officer Davis, citing the stress and danger officers often faced on duty. It wasn't long before the hashtags started circulating, #JusticeForMonroe, #ProtectTheBlue, and what had initially seemed like a personal dispute between two individuals had evolved into a full-scale social and political firestorm. Meanwhile, Officer Davis was grappling with a storm of his own. At first, he had tried to justify his actions. His superiors, although concerned, were sympathetic. They knew he had made a mistake, but they also understood the high-pressure situations officers often faced. In the days following the incident, Davis spent hours in training sessions, discussing what went wrong, replaying the encounter in his mind. His colleagues reassured him, reminding him that nobody had been hurt, and that sometimes, those things could be chalked up to human error. But deep down, he knew this was bigger than just a mistake. He couldn't escape the feeling that his actions were part of something much more ingrained, something that had been lurking under the surface for years. Davis tried to focus on his work, but the weight of the incident was beginning to eat at him. He wasn't just worried about his job, though that was certainly a concern, but about the larger implications of his actions. He had been reckless, yes, but more troubling was the nagging realization that he hadn't just reacted out of fear or stress. He had reacted out of an instinct that had been built over time, one shaped by his upbringing, by the culture of the force, and by the assumptions he had made about Monroe from the moment he pulled her over. Despite his fears, Davis wasn't ready to admit that he might have been influenced by something deeper than just the immediate threat in front of him. If he were to acknowledge that, he'd have to confront uncomfortable truths about himself, and that was something he wasn't sure he was ready to do. But the more he thought about it, the more his doubts festered. He couldn't shake the feeling that his rash decision, his trigger-happy impulse, was symptomatic of a larger, systemic issue in policing. And the worst part was, he didn't know how to fix it. In a quiet moment one evening, Davis received a call from his partner, Sarah, who had been following the news. "You've got to stop watching the news," she said, her voice tight. They're coming after you, Davis. People are angry. You're not going to get away with this. I know, he replied, rubbing his face. I just don't know what to do. I didn't mean for it to go down like that. I don't even know what I was thinking. Sarah's silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. She knew exactly what he was thinking. They had been together long enough for her to see the cracks in his facade. Davis had always been the kind of guy who didn't want to confront the uncomfortable truths. He was good at following orders, keeping his head down. But now, with the world watching, it wasn't so easy to keep pretending everything was fine. Meanwhile, the public uproar continued to grow, dividing opinions and sharpening the tensions between different communities. Protesters took to the streets, chanting for justice, while others wore blue ribbons in support of law enforcement officers who they believed were being unfairly criticized. It wasn't just a dispute between Monroe and Davis anymore, it was a battle for the very soul of law enforcement in the community. Behind the scenes, Monroe's superiors in the military were quietly watching the situation unfold. They understood the implications of her actions, and they knew the political ramifications were enormous. Her report had been filed, but as with all things military, there was an air of bureaucracy that slowed down any real progress. She had been in touch with her commanding officers, but the words they used, stay calm, stay professional, only served to highlight the frustration she felt. They wanted her to let it go, to move on, but Monroe knew better. This wasn't something that could be swept under the rug. Not for her. Not for anyone. In private moments, Monroe reflected on her years of service. She had given so much of herself to the military, to the country. She had seen things no one should ever have to see, and yet, it was this one moment, a traffic stop that should have been routine, that had the power to change everything. She had to hold someone accountable, not just for herself but for the future of law enforcement and military relations. But who would listen? Would anyone believe her if she spoke out? Would they even care? As the days stretched on, the uncertainty only deepened. Would Davis face the consequences of his actions? Would Monroe's efforts to seek justice go unheard? The clock was ticking, but the answers remained just out of reach, leaving both sides to wonder how far this conflict would go. As the days wore on, both Lieutenant Colonel Monroe and Officer Davis found themselves trapped in a relentless cycle of uncertainty, their paths inexplicably intertwined despite the distance between them. The public firestorm around the incident wasn't dying down, if anything, it was intensifying. The media, hungry for every twist and turn, painted the story in stark, black and white terms. Monroe was hailed as a victim of police misconduct, while Davis was becoming the face of a problem that many felt was deeply rooted in law enforcement. For every headline calling for justice, there was another defending the officer, arguing that he was merely reacting to a tense situation. But inside, Monroe felt the weight of her own doubts. She had stood firm in her belief that justice must prevail, but the longer the case dragged on, the more she questioned whether anyone would really listen. She had served her country faithfully, but now it felt like the system that she had once trusted was conspiring against her. Those who were supposed to uphold the law were the ones. Raced as she scrolled through the details. The news outlet was reporting that Davis was being investigated for possible involvement in a much bigger scheme, one that went beyond a single reckless act of misconduct. Monroe's stomach twisted as she read about allegations of corruption within the department. Whispers had started to spread, pointing to a network of officers possibly linked to criminal activity, embezzlement, bribery, even ties to organized crime. The more Monroe read, the more she realized this wasn't just about Davis anymore. This was about exposing an entire system, one that had allowed officers to abuse their power, their position, for far too long. The small mistake on that day, the drawing of a weapon, had now been overshadowed by this massive revelation. Monroe felt her world shift. The stakes had just gotten exponentially higher. It wasn't just about holding one officer accountable for his actions. Now, the entire department, maybe even the entire force, could be implicated in something far worse than she ever imagined. The corruption that was now coming to light cast a shadow over everything. What had been a singular, personal confrontation between two people was now part of a much larger and far more dangerous narrative. The question of whether Officer Davis would face consequences for his reckless actions was suddenly less significant in the face of the possibility that the entire department's integrity might be in question. Monroe knew this would change everything. She had been fighting for accountability, for justice, but she hadn't fully understood how deep the rot went. She had no idea how high the corruption ran, but now, she was a part of something much bigger, something that could bring down the very system she had once trusted. As she processed the news, she also realized something that made her pulse race. The anonymous tip she had received just days earlier had been a warning. Whoever had sent it knew this story was going to break. And they knew that Davis wasn't the only one under investigation. In fact, they probably knew even more than she did. Monroe's instincts screamed at her to dig deeper, to get to the bottom of it before it was too late. But she knew this was dangerous territory. If the corruption ran as deep as the report suggested, her own life could be at risk. She wasn't just fighting against an officer now. She was fighting against an entire system that could destroy anyone who stood in its way. Meanwhile, Davis, still reeling from the pressure of the ongoing investigation, had no idea how the media storm had just taken a sudden and dangerous turn. He had been waiting anxiously for a decision, hoping for some sign that the worst was over. He had never imagined that something as simple as a routine internal review would spiral into an investigation of this magnitude. But as he sat in his car, scrolling through the news on his phone, the words struck him like a punch to the gut. He dropped his phone in disbelief. Corruption? Ties to criminal organizations? He felt his world shift beneath him, just as Monroe had moments before. His own mistakes, his own actions, seemed like small ripples compared to the waves that were crashing down now. He had been wrapped up in a singular moment of panic, pointing his gun at Monroe, a decision driven by something inside of him he hadn't been able to understand. But now, the reality was dawning on him. His actions weren't the only ones being scrutinized. He wasn't just under investigation for his own recklessness, he was now caught in something much more sinister. Davis had always felt like a small part of a much larger system. But now, he could no longer deny that he had been living in the shadows of something far more dangerous, and he had no idea how deep it went. The corruption, the collusion, it was all too much for him to process. But one thing was clear, if he didn't figure out where he stood in all of this, he might not just lose his job, he might lose everything. With the news breaking in every corner of the city, the public reaction was swift and volatile. Protesters who had already been calling for Davis's resignation now found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about law enforcement. Their anger wasn't just about a botched traffic stop anymore. It was about a system that was fundamentally broken, one where officers who were supposed to protect the public were now being linked to criminal activities. Monroe's fight for justice had suddenly become the fight for transparency and reform on a scale she hadn't even imagined. The fight wasn't just about Davis anymore. It was about the entire department, and maybe, by extension, the entire system. Monroe could feel the weight of the moment, the turning point where everything was about to change. She knew she had to act quickly. The more she learned about the corruption, the more she understood that this was her chance to do something real. To expose it all, to stand up not just for herself, but for the countless people who had suffered at the hands of a system that was supposed to protect them. But she also knew the risks. This wasn't just about a civilian officer and a military officer anymore. There were far greater powers at play, and there were people who would go to any lengths to keep this secret buried. With every passing moment, Monroe's sense of urgency grew. She had seen enough in her life to know that when systems like this were threatened, The consequences were never predictable. There was no telling what would happen next, but one thing was for sure, this was only the beginning. She would have to push further, dig deeper, and face the dangers head-on. But would she be able to survive the storm that was coming? Or was the system so corrupt that no one could stop it from collapsing on itself? As the truth began to unravel, the stakes grew ever higher. The story was far from over, and no one knew just how far this would go. But the one thing everyone could feel was that things were about to get much, much worse before they could ever get better. Raced as she scrolled through the details. The news outlet was reporting that Davis was being investigated for possible involvement in a much bigger scheme, one that went beyond a single reckless act of misconduct. Monroe's stomach twisted as she read about allegations of corruption within the department. Whispers had started to spread, pointing to a network of officers possibly linked to criminal activity, embezzlement, bribery, even ties to organized crime. The more Monroe read, the more she realized this wasn't just about Davis anymore. This was about exposing an entire system, one that had allowed officers to abuse their power, their position, for far too long. The small mistake on that day, the drawing of a weapon, had now been overshadowed by this massive revelation. Monroe felt her world shift. The stakes had just gotten exponentially higher. It wasn't just about holding one officer accountable for his actions. Now, the entire department, maybe even the entire force, could be implicated in something far worse than she ever imagined. The corruption that was now coming to light cast a shadow over everything. What had been a singular, personal confrontation between two people was now part of a much larger and far more dangerous narrative. The question of whether Officer Davis would face consequences for his reckless actions was suddenly less significant in the face of the possibility that the entire department's integrity might be in question. Monroe knew this would change everything. She had been fighting for accountability, for justice, but she hadn't fully understood how deep the rot went. She had no idea how high the corruption ran, but now, she was a part of something much bigger, something that could bring down the very system she had once trusted. As she processed the news, she also realized something that made her pulse race. The anonymous tip she had received just days earlier had been a warning. Whoever had sent it knew this story was going to break. And they knew that Davis wasn't the only one under investigation. In fact, they probably knew even more than she did. Monroe's instincts screamed at her to dig deeper, to get to the bottom of it before it was too late. But she knew this was dangerous territory. If the corruption ran as deep as the report suggested, her own life could be at risk. She wasn't just fighting against an officer now. She was fighting against an entire system that could destroy anyone who stood in its way. Meanwhile, Davis, still reeling from the pressure of the ongoing investigation, had no idea how the media storm had just taken a sudden and dangerous turn. He had been waiting anxiously for a decision, hoping for some sign that the worst was over. He had never imagined that something as simple as a routine internal review would spiral into an investigation of this magnitude. But as he sat in his car, scrolling through the news on his phone, the words struck him like a punch to the gut. He dropped his phone in disbelief. Corruption? Ties to criminal organizations? He felt his world shift beneath him, just as Monroe had moments before. His own mistakes, his own actions, seemed like small ripples compared to the waves that were crashing down now. He had been wrapped up in a singular moment of panic, pointing his gun at Monroe, a decision driven by something inside of him he hadn't been able to understand. But now, the reality was dawning on him. His actions weren't the only ones being scrutinized. He wasn't just under investigation for his own recklessness, he was now caught in something much more sinister. Davis had always felt like a small part of a much larger system. But now, he could no longer deny that he had been living in the shadows of something far more dangerous, and he had no idea how deep it went. The corruption, the collusion, it was all too much for him to process. But one thing was clear, If he didn't figure out where he stood in all of this, he might not just lose his job, he might lose everything. With the news breaking in every corner of the city, the public reaction was swift and volatile. Protesters who had already been calling for Davis's resignation now found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew about law enforcement. Their anger wasn't just about a botched traffic stop anymore. It was about a system that was fundamentally broken, one where officers who were supposed to protect the public were now being linked to criminal activities. Monroe's fight for justice had suddenly become the fight for transparency and reform on a scale she hadn't even imagined. The fight wasn't just about Davis anymore. It was about the entire department, and maybe, by extension, the entire system. Monroe could feel the weight of the moment, the turning point where everything was about to change. She knew she had to act quickly. The more she learned about the corruption, the more she understood that this was her chance to do something real. To expose it all, to stand up not just for herself, but for the countless people who had suffered at the hands of a system that was supposed to protect them. But she also knew the risks. This wasn't just about a civilian officer and a military officer anymore. There were far greater powers at play, and there were people who would go to any lengths to keep this secret buried. With every passing moment, Monroe's sense of urgency grew. She had seen enough in her life to know that when systems like this were threatened, the consequences were never predictable. There was no telling what would happen next, but one thing was for sure, this was only the beginning. She would have to push further, dig deeper, and face the dangers head-on. But would she be able to survive the storm that was coming? Or was the system so corrupt that no one could stop it from collapsing on itself? As the truth began to unravel, the stakes grew ever higher. The story was far from over, and no one knew just how far this would go. But the one thing everyone could feel was that things were about to get much worse before they could ever get better. The city was on edge. Tensions had reached a boiling point as the news of the corruption investigation spread like wildfire, sparking protests, debates, and countless social media discussions. Monroe could barely sleep, her mind racing with the implications of everything that had unfolded. What started as a momentary encounter between her and Officer Davis had turned into a full-blown reckoning for the police department, one that threatened to consume not just the officers involved, but the very fabric of law enforcement itself. She had no choice now but to move forward and ensure that the truth came to light. There could be no turning back. In the days following the breaking news, the pressure on Davis was unbearable. He knew he was under a microscope. Rumors swirled that he was about to be fired, and there was little sympathy for him from the public. His actions had drawn the eyes of everyone, not just for his mishandling of the traffic stop, but now for his potential involvement in something far darker. But as much as Davis feared for his job, what terrified him more was the thought of losing everything: his reputation, his career, his identity. He had lived his entire life trying to do what was right, but now, with the weight of corruption hanging over him, he didn't know where the truth ended and the lies began. Monroe's decision to push forward with exposing the corruption wasn't easy, but she knew it was the only path left. She'd spoken with her sources, gathered evidence, and pieced together a picture of the department's dark dealings. She'd found connections, officers tied to corrupt practices, accepting bribes from criminal organizations, and covering for one another in a way that ran deeper than she could have ever imagined. Her instinct told her that she needed to go public, to bring this information to light. She couldn't afford to let the truth slip away in the face of pressure from those who wanted it buried. Then, one late afternoon, everything changed. Monroe had received a message, a meeting request from someone within the department. It wasn't unusual for her to get information from insiders, but this one felt different. The message was cryptic, but it mentioned something that caught her attention: the truth is much darker than you think. Meet me, and I'll explain everything. Her pulse quickened as she realized what this could mean. If she met with this person, It could be her chance to uncover the full extent of the corruption, but it could also be a trap. She weighed the risks carefully, but deep down, she knew she couldn't back down now. She had come too far, and the stakes were too high. Monroe agreed to the meeting. She chose a secluded park late at night, neutral ground, with no one around. She arrived first, scanning the area cautiously, her mind alert to every sound. Minutes passed, and just as she started to question whether anyone would show, she saw a figure approaching in the dim light. The person was tall, wearing a hooded jacket, their face obscured. Monroe's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know who they were, but her gut told her they had something important to say. "Lieutenant Colonel Monroe?" the figure asked, their voice low and steady. Monroe nodded, trying to keep her composure. "You have information for me. What's going on?" The figure stepped closer, their eyes glinting with something Monroe couldn't quite read. "You're asking the wrong questions. It's not about Davis. Not really. It's about the system, the people behind him. You've been looking in the wrong direction all along." Monroe's stomach tightened. "What do you mean? Who are you?" The figure hesitated before finally pulling down the hood, revealing a familiar face, one she hadn't seen in years. It was Captain Thompson, a senior officer she had served with in the military. He had retired years ago, and their paths hadn't crossed since. But now, seeing him in this context, it felt like a betrayal. "You?" Monroe whispered, the shock registering in her voice. "You're behind this?" Thompson looked tired, his eyes darkened by years of guilt and secrets. "No, not behind it. But I know what's been going on. I've been trying to stop it, but they've covered their tracks too well. The corruption runs deeper than you think, Monroe. I came to warn you, it's not just about Davis. It's about the people who pull the strings, who control everything from the inside." Monroe felt her legs go weak as the gravity of his words sank in. "What are you saying? Who's behind all of this?" Thompson's gaze flicked nervously to the shadows, and then he leaned in close. "The whole department, hell, the whole system, it's all tied together. But the real shock is who's involved. You've been looking at Davis as the villain, but there are people far more powerful who have been pulling the strings for years. People you never thought would be part of this." Monroe's mind reeled. She had been so focused on exposing Davis, she hadn't considered that the corruption could run this deep. She thought of all the officers she had known, all the people she had trusted. And yet, now it seemed like everything was a lie. She had stumbled into a vast, tangled web. Before Monroe could respond, Thompson's expression turned grim. "Listen to me, there's no time to waste. You need to be careful, Monroe. You're in over your head. Whoever you think you're fighting, it's bigger than you realize. If you go public with this, you're going to expose yourself to forces that won't hesitate to silence you." Monroe's voice was steady, though her pulse was racing. "I'm not afraid of them. The truth has to come out. It's the only way to fix this." Thompson shook his head. "You're wrong. You don't get it. The people who control this city, who control the force, they have eyes everywhere. You're not just going to lose your career, you could lose everything. Your life, your safety. They'll destroy you before you even realize what's happening." Just as Monroe was about to argue, a figure stepped out of the darkness, cutting their conversation short. Monroe's heart skipped. It was Davis. But there was something different about him now. His face was pale, his eyes wild with desperation. "Monroe, don't do it," he said, his voice trembling. "You have to stop. You don't understand what's going on." Monroe stared at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" Davis swallowed hard, his gaze shifting nervously between Thompson and Monroe. "It's not just the department. It's the people who are supposed to be protecting you, people you've trusted. You've been looking at the wrong side all this time. I thought I was a part of the problem, but I'm just a pawn. You've been played from the beginning. Monroe's heart raced as she pieced the puzzle together. Davis wasn't trying to protect himself. He was warning her. Something else was happening, something she hadn't even considered. And then, with a sudden rush of clarity, Monroe understood the final twist. Captain Thompson wasn't just a whistleblower, he was part of the larger conspiracy. Davis wasn't the true villain. The people pulling the strings weren't just hiding behind badges and uniforms, they were in positions of power, orchestrating everything from behind closed doors. People who were using both the police force and the military to further their own dark agendas. Monroe had been caught in the middle of a dangerous game, and no one, not even Davis or Thompson, was truly on her side. The stakes had just become far greater than any of them could have anticipated. And now, with the full weight of the corruption crashing down on them, Monroe realized that the only way out was to play the game her way, no matter what the cost. Monroe stood frozen, her mind racing as she tried to process the revelation that had just unfolded in front of her. The people she thought she could trust, the ones she thought had her back in her fight for justice, were not who they seemed. She had been chasing the wrong answers this whole time. The corruption wasn't just within the police force, it was embedded in the very heart of the system, stretching to the highest levels of power. She had no idea how deep the conspiracy went, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't trust anyone now. Not even the people who were supposed to help her uncover the truth. Davis looked at her, his face filled with a strange mix of regret and desperation. "You don't understand, Monroe. This goes way beyond us. It's bigger than one officer, bigger than one department. This is about control, about the kind of power they're willing to do anything to keep." Monroe shook her head, refusing to let the weight of his words crush her. "I don't care how deep it goes. People deserve to know. I won't back down now." Thompson, his eyes dark with guilt, stepped closer. "You're playing with fire, Monroe. The moment you expose this, they'll come for you. You'll lose everything you fought for." But Monroe was beyond fear at that point. She had seen too much, felt too much. The fight for justice wasn't about holding one man accountable, it was about dismantling the system that allowed so much harm to continue in the shadows. She wasn't going to let this go, not now, not after everything she had sacrificed to get this far. "I've lost enough already," Monroe said, her voice steady. "I won't stop. The truth has to come out, no matter the cost." Davis's expression hardened, and for a moment, it felt like they were staring at each other across a chasm. He was torn between his own guilt and the fear of what would happen if Monroe went through with exposing everything. But something inside of him shifted. Maybe it was the knowledge that he, too, had been a victim of this broken system. Or maybe it was the realization that Monroe wasn't going to back down. Either way, the choice he made in that moment was clear. "I'll help you," Davis said, his voice firm. "I've made mistakes. I've been part of this system, but I won't let them destroy you. If we're going to expose this, we need to be smart about it. We need the right evidence." Monroe felt a sense of relief. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. For the first time in what felt like forever, she had an ally, someone who understood the gravity of the situation. But there was no time to celebrate. The stakes had never been higher, and the danger was closing in fast. Over the next few days, Monroe and Davis worked together, piecing together the damning evidence that would expose the corruption at the highest levels. They met in secret, using encrypted communications to avoid being tracked. Monroe reached out to her contacts, gathering the names of officers, political figures, and even businessmen who were involved in the network of corruption. As the pieces came together, the picture became clear: this was a web that had ensnared far more people than either of them had imagined. The power brokers who controlled everything from law enforcement to government were the true puppeteers behind it all. But as they neared the moment when they would go public with the information, they were faced with an unexpected obstacle. Thompson, the man who had once been their ally, had disappeared. His phone went silent, his whereabouts unknown. Monroe's heart sank as she realized that he might have been silenced, his involvement in the conspiracy now a danger to both of them. Someone wanted them to stop, to back off, and they weren't going to stop until Monroe and Davis were out of the picture. Monroe knew they had to act fast. She couldn't wait any longer. The truth had to be exposed, or it would be buried forever. They took the final step, working with trusted journalists who were willing to publish the information, despite the risks involved. The night before the story was set to break, Monroe couldn't sleep. She sat alone in her apartment, staring at the files on her desk, knowing that her life was about to change forever. The decision to move forward was final. There was no turning back now. The following morning, the story hit the news. The investigation into the police department's corruption went viral, with every major outlet covering it. The evidence was overwhelming, detailing a network of criminal activities spanning from bribery to organized crime, all tied to key figures in law enforcement and politics. The public was shocked, outraged, and stunned. For the first time, the full scope of the corruption was laid bare for everyone to see. But the fallout was immediate. Protests erupted in the streets. People demanded action, wanted justice for the years of abuse they had suffered. Some called for the resignation of high-ranking officials, while others called for a complete overhaul of the system. But amidst the chaos, there were those who tried to silence the voices of those who spoke out. Monroe was receiving threats. Davis was no longer safe in his own home. The fight for justice had taken a dangerous turn, but it was a fight they were both committed to. The department's leadership began to crumble. Key officials were arrested, and investigations into their activities spread to other cities. But with every victory, new challenges emerged. The system fought back, trying to discredit the revelations, casting doubt on the credibility of the journalists and whistleblowers. But Monroe knew that the tide had turned. The public wasn't going to let this be swept under the rug. People had seen the truth, and they weren't going to let it go. For Monroe, the victory was bittersweet. She had exposed the truth, but the cost was high. She had lost friends, faced betrayal, and walked away from a system she had once believed in. But she had also gained something priceless, the knowledge that her fight had made a difference, that the world had been changed by the courage to stand up and speak out. As for Davis, his path wasn't as clear. He had helped expose the corruption, but the road ahead for him was uncertain. He was no longer a cop, his career shattered by his involvement in the scandal. But the weight of his actions had been lifted, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had done the right thing. He wasn't sure where his future lay, but he knew one thing: he had been given a chance at redemption. Monroe stood at the crossroads of her own journey. The battle had been won, but the war for true justice was far from over. The corruption she had uncovered was just one layer of a much larger issue that needed to be addressed. The fight for accountability, for transparency, for a fair and just system, this was only the beginning. And as she looked out at the city, knowing that the road ahead would be long and full of challenges, she realized that she had made her choice. She had chosen to be the voice of the voiceless, to expose the darkness even when it seemed impossible. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't over, but it was worth it. Because in the end, the truth had come to light, and the world was never going to be the same. The dust had barely settled after the exposé, but the aftermath was far from over. The revelations about the corruption within the police department had shaken the city to its core. Public outrage flooded the streets in the form of protests, petitions, and calls for reform. The media covered every angle. But the truth was undeniable: a network of criminal activity, concealed under the badge of law enforcement, had been exposed. Monroe had become the face of this revelation, and while she had been prepared for the personal fallout, nothing could have prepared her for the intensity of the storm that followed. She had lost friends in the process, those who were once close to her, who had worked beside her. Some turned their backs, some kept silent, and others, who had been complicit in the very corruption she had fought to expose, remained hidden in the shadows, refusing to take accountability. Her phone rang incessantly with calls from the press, colleagues, and even anonymous sources hoping to offer more information. Some reached out with genuine tips, others with threats. The weight of being at the center of this movement was something Monroe had never fully anticipated. But amid all the chaos, one thing remained clear: she had to continue fighting. She couldn't back down now, not after everything that had happened. The police department was in disarray. The first wave of arrests was swift, targeting key officers who had been directly implicated. But as the investigation widened, it became clear that the corruption ran much deeper. Monroe's revelations had cracked open a door that exposed a systematic problem, a network of power, influence, and cover-ups that had been ingrained for decades. But it wasn't just the officers who were being scrutinized. Political figures, business leaders, and even high-ranking government officials were named as part of the scheme. They had long operated under the assumption that they were untouchable, insulated by their positions of power. Yet, as the investigation gathered momentum, the public demanded accountability, not just from the officers involved, but from anyone who had enabled or protected them. Monroe's own role in the investigation was a double-edged sword. She had been lauded for her courage in exposing the truth, but the media also relentlessly questioned her motives. Was she driven by a desire for justice, or by a personal vendetta against the department? She was both praised as a hero and vilified as a threat to the very system she had once believed in. As much as the praise felt good, it didn't erase the toll it had taken on her life. Davis, on the other hand, had been left to navigate the fallout of his own decisions. He had been one of the key figures in helping Monroe piece together the puzzle, but his involvement in the corruption was undeniable. Though his actions in helping expose the system had been crucial, he was not exempt from the consequences. He was stripped of his badge, dismissed from the department, and faced both legal and social scrutiny. But there was an unexpected shift. Some of the public saw his decision to come forward as an attempt at redemption, while others viewed it as an admission of guilt too late to matter. The road ahead for Davis was uncertain, and he was left to rebuild his life from the wreckage of his past choices. As for Captain Thompson, the one person who had warned Monroe and Davis of the dangers they faced, he had disappeared without a trace. Monroe had hoped he would step forward with more information, more insights into the power structures that controlled everything. But weeks passed, and there were no further leads on his whereabouts. Some speculated that he had gone into hiding, fearing retribution from the very people he had tried to expose. Others believed he had been silenced for good, a casualty of the system he had tried to dismantle. His silence was a haunting reminder of just how deep the corruption ran and how far those in power were willing to go to protect themselves. Monroe, however, wasn't one to leave things unresolved. She continued her investigation, combing through the evidence she had gathered. As the months went by, she uncovered even more disturbing connections, people in positions of power, both inside and outside the department, who were involved in a network that spanned far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The more she uncovered, the more she realized that this wasn't just about police officers and politicians. This was about an entire system, built on a foundation of secrecy and control. Despite the growing pressure and the personal cost, Monroe's resolve didn't waver. The fight wasn't over yet. She had learned the hard way that justice wasn't always served swiftly or easily. It was a long, grueling process, one that involved not just exposing the truth, but dismantling the very system that had allowed the corruption to thrive for so long. Monroe had become disillusioned with the idea that simply revealing the truth would be enough to make everything right. She understood now that the battle for reform, for accountability, was an ongoing one that would require continuous effort, vigilance, and sacrifice. As for the city, things had changed. The police department was undergoing a restructuring, with new leadership, new policies, and an emphasis on transparency. The public, still in shock from the revelations, demanded that the reforms be more than just surface level. The fight for true accountability was far from over, but Monroe knew one thing: the people weren't going to let it go. They had seen the truth, and they were ready to hold their leaders accountable, no matter how much resistance they faced. Monroe, though exhausted, had found a new purpose in the wake of everything that had happened. She had fought for justice and uncovered a truth that had been hidden for far too long. But the fight, she knew, was far from finished. There were still people out there who needed to be held accountable. And there were still those who believed the system would protect them, even as it crumbled beneath the weight of its own corruption. The story wasn't over. The battle for justice was ongoing, and Monroe was no longer just a part of the system. She was a part of something much bigger, an effort to create real, lasting change. And though the future remained uncertain, she knew she would continue the fight, no matter the cost. The truth had come to light, and now it was up to the world to decide what to do with it. In the end, that was the real victory. The system had been shaken. The truth had been uncovered. And though the journey had been long and painful, Monroe had emerged from it stronger, more determined, and more committed to making sure the truth would never be buried again.